Hello, and welcome to Hot Take Express with Kent Chamberlain. I'm your host, Kent Chamberlain, and today we'll be talking about the Plan de Santiago and its Hello, and wrist up Landback to all my fellow revolutionaries among the professional managers in academia. I'm Betty Bourgeois, and I don't think it's acceptable to let Nazbols like Kent have teasers to their videos on stolen land. So rest assured, you beautiful dudes, doll faces, and donos, I'm taking some direct action about it. Land back, you guys! Yeah, that's right, Cupcake. I'm a real revolutionary. I'm not afraid to join chance invented in Langley to destroy us. That's how we win! Anyway, I hijacked this video to tell you guys all about the sweet new idea I had to land back even harder. We're gonna land back so heckin' much that even the people the Romans conquered are gonna get ethnostates, you guys. Okay, so start off with a map of Honkoid Mura. Say it with me, everyone. Ew! Now, we don't want to really mess with the places where trendy revolutionary subjects like me go to nightclubs, so we can do land acknowledgements in New York City, but we can't ever really, actually give Manhattan back to the Cherokee tribe or whoever. Their funny rituals would really, mess with the vibes on the Upper East Side, you know? You try getting the smell of sagebrush out of real suede. So let's, make land back a problem for all those deplorables somewhere far away instead, oh, I know, the Southwest. So we're going to give the Southwest back. But to who? Well, I remember very clearly from my high school history class that I totally paid attention to that the first Spanish speakers came across the Bering Strait more than 25,000 years ago. So the white people in Mexico are okay and totally not colonizers, unlike your Anglo-Gringoid ass. But not mine, because as the ritual accuser in your struggle session, I'm automatically above reproach. Poisoned wells, don't you know? Non-existent. God, I love loitering socialism this hard. So anyway, to keep the white people who speak English out, we're going to have to get the white people who speak Spanish on our side. How? We give them an ethno-state. Let's see. How about Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and California? Make that a buffer state between Mexico and America. Probably call it the People's Republic of Aztlan, or however you say that in Mexican. And when we do, we kill all the honkoid males over the age of 16 in those states, right? And then we promise the help that they can make 6 bordering states ethno-states of their very own if they can just help us murder all the Angloids there too. But just in case it all goes wrong, let's make sure to specify that Mexico had no part in any of this. But it's not going to go wrong. Totally! Promising another round of ethnic cleansing in the Southwest can't possibly blow up in anyone's faces, you guys. All you Tejanerinos, or however you say it, should totally get on board with the sweet plan. All you Indie, Nada, or indigents, or whatever, you should join up too. I think I saw a YouTube video about the Southwest once, so therefore I'm an expert who can assert that you guys are a numerical majority out there, so joining my totally sweet liberating army for races and peoples can only succeed and not result in getting innocent strangers lynched in the race war we're starting. Wrist up, land back! Wrist up, land back!
Hot Take Express.
So this is episode 23, Land Back is the New Golden Circle. And it all circles back to the way that the national question gets used by the bourgeoisie. And the thing is, I've seen a lot of commentators confuse the national question with some other part of the culture war, or they think it's like your opinion on abortion or gay marriage. But the national question is not the same as other aspects of the culture war. As Marx said, the nation is the site of class struggle. It's the place in which class struggle unfolds. It's the context in which class struggle unfolds. So therefore, calling the nation into question preempts the possibility for class struggle. If the world around you is in flux, you focus on finding stable ground first, and then you do other things. I guarantee you, even if you were in the middle of a knife fight on a plane, if that plane just starts shaking around, having extreme turbulence, you're all reaching for oxygen masks and something to grab, the knife fight gets paused, right? And so when you call the nation into question, and fundamental assumptions about the nation that the workers take for granted, you make class struggle impossible. That's why the bourgeoisie always resort to the national questions in some way, shape, or form. America, it being a country where everyone seems to be in denial of themselves, of what they really are. Everything seems to be backwards and opposite of what it presents itself as. in America, this union between the big bourgeoisie and the people interested in revising the national question, it's taken on a form that's aesthetically anti-imperialist and aesthetically rebellious and so forth, but like it's still the same rotten combination that Nazism was, that Confederacy was, even though it's figured out a way to extract the same function out of anti-racism as it has like racism, right? And this is all just to shut down class struggle. The radical Republicans, we advocate the culture truce, but we are very ardent partisans for American patriotism and against things like Landback and other secessionist approaches to the national question. The way we feel functional anti-imperialism can feel however it wants about Marvel turning the Spider-Mans gay, but it can't feel however it wants about the nation. It must uphold it in order to advance the class struggle. This is why historically the bourgeoisie have always turned to Landback and its antecedents as a sort of ideological agent provocateur to protect their wealth by isolating the American workers from any sort of revolutionary forces in society. Antecedents, you might say? You mean to say that Landback has happened before, Kent? Oh my, yes. Sit you down a spell and get learned listening to your Uncle Kent. Alright, so first thing is the Golden Circle. That's going to be one of the things we talk about. The Golden Circle, I've been meaning to make a episode about the nature of the deep state, and the American deep state, I would say, originates in the Golden Circle, and maybe even a little before. The spirit of it, the essential spirit of the thing, was present with the filibusters, the expeditions of adventurers that would go off around Latin America and try to conquer each country. I want to say it was like Nicaragua or Honduras that was actually ruled by filibusters for a while. I mean, like, they had no official connection with the American government, and really their connection with the American government was informal, and it was only with a part of it. Usually the filibusters were partisans of the South and of the spread of slavery. And the Golden Circle was Southern imperialism. As Marx rightly noted, the slave system needed to expand to continue existing. And so the Golden Circle is this notion of uniting the cause of the filibusters with the spread of slavery. These filibustered states in Latin America would just be re-enslaved, and all the good-paying jobs would be for the filibusters, the landless white laborers that would be the muscle of the operation. All the locals, and especially all the darker their skin got, would be greater degrees of unfree, all to make money for the filibusters and their leadership. And these states would be inducted into a much more evil form of the United States, and then later the Confederate States, as slave states. There were Democrats in the 1850s that were even talking about the eventual need to move the capital of the United States to Mexico City because it would be the geographic center of the Union. This is how nutso the Golden Circle idea was getting. But like, notice that it's not too far off from what ended up happening. The Democrats are the party of the big bourgeoisie, or they started off as with Andrew Jackson as the party of the little bourgeoisie, but the little bourgeoisie done good in a generation, and then they were the party of the big bourgeoisie from then on, with occasional reversions to the Jacksonian beginning, such as in the 1890s, but usually they were just the party of the big bourgeoisie, and even in FDR's time that was sort of true. The big bourgeoisie are the imperial bourgeoisie. They're the ones whose class interests drive imperialism, and these filibuster expeditions were outfitted by the big bourgeoisie in many cases, and it was probably the earliest expression of American imperialism. That is, America's attempt to spread its influence and domination outside its shores and sovereignty. You could call what happened in like the West with the subjugation of Native Americans there, you could call that a form of imperialism too, but it was of a different sort because the areas taken and the people taken were intended to become eventually, like this, even back then, with the crap methods they were using to achieve these ends, this was the point, this was the hope, that the land and the natives themselves would all be sort of integrated into the modern American system, which in those days meant Protestant Christianity and English, and leaving their ways behind. That was very, very wrong, and it caused great suffering. But there was a lot of good intention behind these bad acts. They meant well, and this is what they were trying to achieve. And there was never any sort of idea that the filibustered states that the people in them would be brought into any sort of equality or a union themselves. They would at best be the 3/5 of a person that would count for electoral purposes when their masters went to vote. The Golden Circle didn't work because the Confederacy failed, but there were a lot more filibuster expeditions that left that came back, or succeeded rather. A lot of them came back empty-handed. The closest thing I could think of to compare these filibuster expeditions to would be you hear about these nutters, these usually boomer mercenary types that are I'm outfitting an expedition to go kill Castro. We're gonna free Cuba, because they're usually crazy fascist nutters. That's a filibuster, right? These filibusters failed more than they succeeded. Up until recently, the CIA has had a much better success rate keeping Latin America in line. I think a big chunk of it is just the formal sovereignty. The freebooters were a literal foreign invasion done for the benefit of foreigners invading the land and those financing that invasion. It's not hard to get most people in a country, pretty much all of them, to oppose that, and that's basically what happened. The only way the filibusters ever succeeded was if they had overwhelming force of arms and manpower to keep the system going. It was just brute naked force and little else. That's not very efficient. That's ultimately what ended up being the problem with slavery too. And it's more efficient to let people be free and then make them sell their labor. If you're a capitalist, the system of free labor and capitalism was actually more productive for the capitalists themselves than slavery ever was. By letting these countries stay theoretically sovereign while the United States praises their generals leading the junta or whatever as their nation's George Washington or whatever, while the CIA gets a bunch of people killed behind the scenes. That ended up being a much better way to go about implementing the Golden Circle. FDR didn't do it himself. FDR actually intended a lot of good things for Latin America, but those went by the wayside pretty much the moment he died, because the OSS, the intelligence service he'd created to fight the Nazis, they got captured by the Dulles family. The Dulles family had interests in the United Fruit Company, and the United Fruit Company, it's called El Pulpo, or the octopus in Latin America, because it had tentacles in every single country. The United Fruit was just brutal to its workers. It was the filibusters' wet dream, essentially. There was a guy, Jacobo Arbenz, I want to say, that was elected in what was the country? Honduras? Man, I think it was Honduras, and there was CIA Operation PB Success. That was literally meant to put the petty bourgeoisie in power, hence PB Success. They overthrew the government. They instituted a military junta. Anyone left of liberal was basically hunted down for sport, and that was the government down there for a good long while, unfortunately. The Golden Circle, that's where the notions of American imperialism started. They hadn't perfected the techniques yet. They hadn't gotten it as subtle as the deep state's gotten it, but they had gotten the basic notion down, and it would go far, far beyond the scope that the Golden Circle envisioned, which mostly just figured they would control Latin America and maybe the Philippines. The Golden Circle ended up spreading worldwide by the end of the Cold War, but that's just one of the things I wanted to tell you about. Anyway, the next thing was alluded to in the teaser, the plan to San Diego. On January 23rd, 1913, when Basilio Ramos Jr. was caught with plans to overthrow American rule throughout the Southwest. He was one of 9 conspirators who signed the so-called Plan de San Diego, the San Diego in this case being in the same Texas as the town of McAllen where he was caught. The supposed ringleader of this conspiracy, titled President of the Supreme Revolutionary Congress of San Diego, Texas, was a mysterious El Ferino who was never identified. If I know my Spanish right, Ferino roughly means blacksmith, so it would have been a pseudonym meant to identify them with their industrial workers, most likely. It is entirely possible that he never existed at all and would have been an early 1900s version of Jay Sakai. As alluded to in the teaser, the Plan de San Diego called for the genocide of all Anglo men over the age of 16 within the states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Upper California, as they phrased it. They would declare the independence of these 6 states, possibly as a sovereign nation, possibly rejoining Mexico. The plan didn't specify. The natives and minorities who helped were also supposed to be given their own ethno-states by their so-called Liberating Army for Races and Peoples in 6 unspecified bordering states, after butchering the Anglos there in similar manner first. They set a time for this general rising, genocide, and nation-building, February 20th, 1915. Racial tensions between Anglos and Tejanos flared until then, with several Tejano bandidos like Aniceto Pizana and Luis de la Rosa committing massacres of Anglos that were then met with even larger atrocities of Tejanos. The day of rising came and went without incident, but many innocent people had already been lynched. Somewhere between 300 and 5,000 Tejanos died because of the Plan de San Diego, an ultra-radical proto-Landback document so woke it's actually fascist. Roughly 400 Anglos died as well in the violence. This all went down with the First World War breaking out in the background and the Mexican Revolution breaking out in the foreground after the end of what Mexicans call the Porfiriano, the racist, autocratic, but developmental regime named for the dictator Porfirio Diaz. The struggle between bandidos, revolutionaries, and federales in El Norte sometimes spilled across the border, and American border settlements were occasionally raided. The federal government was surprisingly laid back about this at first. The president in those days was the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, and Democrats of the post-Civil War era generally tried to defund the army because they fundamentally distrusted the ideological motivations of the organization that had freed their slaves. So he was loath to summon them to do anything, especially back to a southern state like Texas. So the Texas Rangers were responsible for protecting the border during the height of the crisis, and even though an investigation in 1919 later officially absolved them of all misconduct, at least some of their personnel almost certainly engaged in lynchings of Tejanos. Ultimately, the only action taken by the Democrats running the federal government was to keep the semi-revolutionary Grand Army of the Republic out of the South and turn a blind eye to local militias lynching their way to victory. Woodrow Wilson was the same shitlib who screened the racist pro-Ku Klux Klan movie Birth of a Nation at the White House, so we shouldn't be too surprised. We also shouldn't be too surprised to see Woodrow Wilson's pink-haired bastard stepchildren behaving the same exact way with different race-nat ideologies. But anyway, who was responsible for the Plan de San Diego? It's possible, but unlikely, that it was written by who it was claimed to be. If it was, they were ultra-radicals of the stupidest sort that got their own people killed for nothing. But perhaps it was the German government. They would later send the Zimmerman telegram to Mexico, offering more or less the same states as were in the Plan de San Diego if they entered on the Central Powers side should America join the Entente. It was probably the stupidest thing among the many and varied stupidities of Kaiser Wilhelm I, and eventually guaranteed American entry into World War I against him, sealing the fate of the House of Hohenzollern for good. But even though this was a stupid plan and Mexico in no wise could have won a second Mexican-American war, if it was the determined diplomatic goal of the German state to carry it out, this is one way they could have used to do that. It would have been a perfectly natural use of spycraft to plant a patsy with a fake document in a border town where he'd be sure to be discovered, in order to stoke racial tensions and set the stage for a later war between the new two nations. But if it was German spycraft responsible for the Plan de San Diego, it only stoked tensions that were easily transferred to the Germans by the independent British and American interceptions of the Zimmerman telegram, and hastened the war, so pushing Victorian Landback would have only thoroughly blown up in their faces. Perhaps it was the Mexican government of Venustiano Carranza The Wilson administration had yet to recognize any government in Mexico after the fall of the Porfiriano. So perhaps by creating a border crisis between some Tejano rebel ultras in the United States, the Carranza administration ruling in Mexico City could finally secure American recognition in exchange for help containing the border crisis. The implicit message would be that surely Carranza would be better for American interests than the bloody proto-Landback crews that could be ruling Mexico one day if Carranza's government were allowed to fall. This is the message that the Wilson administration would eventually get, leading to American recognition followed by Carranza's swift reconquest of El Norte soon afterwards. This theory has the most recent scholarly consensus behind it, but it's still far from certain that this is what would have happened. It's also possible that it was the forces of the conservative general Victoriano Huerta. All 9 signatories were said to be Huertistas by the testimony of Basilio Ramos Jr. At the time, the Huertistas had a reasonable hope for victory in the Civil War, and their calculus for arranging something like this to be discovered by the Americans would have been much the same as Carranza's. Perhaps it was the faction led by Pancho Villa, whose representatives turned Basilio Ramos Jr. over to the Americans in the first place. This could have been a demonstration that the American government could trust the Villa faction to rule Mexico without fear of extremists poisoning the relationship. If so, it was a futile gesture because the Americans and the Villistas came to blows anyway in the Battle of Columbus in 1916, after American recognition was granted to the Carranza government, strongly suggesting the involvement of at least one of the Mexican factions was the provision in the Plan de San Diego that disclaimed all support for Mexico. It would have been an obvious provision for any Mexican faction behind it to slip in order to avoid blowback directly against what they all hoped would be their eventually victorious government. The plan could have even been devised by the Texas state government as a way to show the reluctant Wilson administration that their problems with the bandidos were indeed serious enough for federal protection. So yeah, that's the Plan de San Diego. This is why I'm not cool with Landback. This is why I take such a strong stance against it, is because the history tells of how dangerous it is. But anyway, so let's talk a little bit more about just the nature of Landback and the forms it's taken over the years. All the different race nats. And there have been claims made that different race nats are not all the same. That, some are revolutionary and some are reactionary. They're all reactionary. White nationalism is the same as black nationalism and all other race nationalism. Because the heart of it all isn't anything but we're special and can do things others can't. This expresses itself in ways great and small, like white nationalists saying they're the master race, and black nationalists saying they're the only ones that can say the N-word. Honestly, I don't think anyone should say that word. There's a belief that for some reason or another, you're special. The color of your skin makes you special somehow. The justification for this is always different because they are all special snowflakes and they're all alike in their differences. They're all the mall goths or, whatever. Why are they special? Well, because we're the master race, or because our ancestors' suffering was great, or because our ancestors were here first, or because our ancestors were the first Europeans here. That last one, I especially just do not get how the Landback crews are all like trying to give the land back to the Mexicans. The Spanish were European settler colonials too, why are the Spanish better than the English? Why do they have rights that the Anglos don't? I think it really just comes down to these synthetic leftoids don't know their history, these Landbackaroos. And so because they don't know their history, they see Mexicans are disadvantaged today. So, their cause must be just and must have historical logic behind it. And they just don't look any further than that. In reality, in a federal union like ours, everyone has a right to be here, and everyone's rights ought to be equally vindicated. So that's really the only solution forward, which is why and the radical Republicans are pushing it. But yeah, regardless of justification, the result is the same. Race nats of all types are just people who are vicious to others on the basis of race alone. Like, I've talked about it before, but I've dealt with black gnats and native race gnats that are just absolutely nasty to everyone that's not them. Sometimes even other race gnats. Yeah, the Lakota race gnats hate the Crow race gnats and vice versa. And it's just nuts. And like these people, especially because of the liberals, they think they can get away with it. They can just play the race card if the liberals try to correct them, and the liberals will shy away with their tail tucked between their legs like they do. It always befuddled me in college when I was first seeing this and trying to make sense of it. Even if society lets you be a jerk, being a jerk is still wrong. All of this points to the impossibility of race nats to really prevail in the long term. The Black Panthers failed because a rainbow coalition is impossible to sustain. To wit, what the Black Panthers meant by a rainbow coalition was that they were going to have like everyone organized on the basis of their race. Like they were going to send the young patriots who like thought Confederate flags were cool out to like organize all the white people, and they Black Panthers would organize all the black people. And I think it was the Young Lords that were going to organize all the like Hispanics, or I forget exactly how that was all going to break down. But first off, like I find the notion offensive. Like I generally think the Black Panthers meant well, but I wouldn't have joined the Young Patriots, and I wouldn't have joined any native race nats either. It doesn't speak to me. Confederate flags don't speak to me. Being organized along the lines of my white identity doesn't speak to me. I don't care that my skin is white. It is one of the least important things about me. And anyone trying to rally me on that basis is going to get raised eyebrows. And furthermore, this is the case with most Americans. At best, they were like maybe going to rally the Dust James types in the Klan with this strategy. You know, people that care that hard about their ethnicity, and that's not most Americans. Most Americans are happy integrationists. That's why the union works. The union is a rainbow coalition in practice because none of the people involved, or at least a very tiny minority of the people involved, are race nats. 90% of America are integrationists, and it's like 10% that are race nats at best. And like I think 7% of that 10% is white nationalists, and the last 3% are like black nats, Hispanic nats, native nats, etc. Integrationism is the only way for a rainbow coalition to work, and that is almost like a definitional problem because like the Black Panthers coined the term of the rainbow coalition. They wrote the theory of it, and they intended it as a coming together of separate types of race nats. Integrationism is something else. Not to be like the annoying white guy telling all the black people what Martin Luther King Jr. thought, but integrationism is literally what Martin Luther King Jr. thought. Race nats, and they oppose integrationism and can't treat each other as equals. And it's not just white nats, okay? Like the FBI was able to disrupt black and Berequan organizing in the 60s by just like the pettiest of things like, well, you know, black people shouldn't be speaking for Berequans. This is what the Rainbow Coalition was sort of intended to counter directly, was these FBI agent provocateurs just starting these racial fights. But yeah, any rainbow coalition will be consumed over who gets to be in charge. Here's a rainbow coalition, the Axis in World War II. That's actually true. Like you had German race nats and Italian race nats and Japanese race nats. But in the Axis, Italy and Japan were treated like Untermenschen by the Germans. Because, yeah, each Axis power had national visions that intruded on the others. And this expressed itself a lot of times with like Italy trying to like be half as cool as like the German war machine and just like getting their butts handed to them by Greece as a result and needing to be bailed out by the Germans and looking even more pathetic. They also were generally hoping that they would be able to offload their burden of the war onto their partners, the Germans and the Japanese especially, and the Italians onto the Germans especially too. They weren't able to coordinate with each other. They saw the Axis as a subsidy for their nation's ambitions. And so this master race issue, it's a coordination problem at its heart. They can't work together in the way that the Allies could, in the way that the integrationist powers of Britain and America and the Soviet Union could. They shared whole economies and nuclear secrets to win. Harry Hopkins got the Americans to bankroll a big chunk of what was going on in the Soviet Union during the war years. Britain gave the Americans everything they knew about nuclear weapons. Yeah, that's part of why integrationism is more successful in the long run, is because it solves the coordination problem in a way that hyper-focus on race and ethnicity never will. The last Rainbow Coalition in practice was the Axis, and the next will be the Democrats in the next Civil War. The Marxist-Leninist concept of communists changing sides between left and right every 80 years during a recurring 80-year cycles of capitalist crisis. That's why I call it Marxism-Leninism. Well, one of the many reasons is because we're heading into times today that are reminiscent of the American Civil War period, when the Union was the good guys and the Confederacy and the Democrats were the bad guys. In both cases, these rainbow coalitions are the bad guys. The Axis was, a rainbow coalition and definitely the bad guys. The Democrats today, the woke fascists, are definitely the bad guys. Wokeness set the stage for these leftoids to see themselves in terms of identity first. I couldn't even imagine what it would look like when I first predicted this in Class Analysis and Revolution. Class Analysis told me it would come true. I believed it, and it has. And what I foresaw was essentially this rainbow coalition come true, which is the heart of the modern Democrat Party. Yeah, the race nats will be drawn to the Dems if they haven't been already. It's their natural home. The most advanced theorists of the race nat set are in the Democrats. They're the party of the big bourgeoisie, and in a capitalist crisis, the big bourgeoisie always ally with the race nats against conservatives and communists. Angela Davis, one of the original Black Panthers, she sold out to the Dems and danced on the grave of the USSR in public. Dust James, he's a spiritual descendant of the Young Patriots, and he's a Democrat now. Richard Spencer, he was a Nazi. He was riding with Biden until Obama took his keys. The lumpen rappers and gangsters that the Black Panthers reached out to, they're almost all of them Democrats now. So if there's some race nats that claim to be opposed to the Democrats, but their friends are all leftoid Dem enjoyers in bed with the CIA, and they push Landback lines cooked up in Langley, then they have a massive trust deficit to make up before the American workers and the orgs that represent them will want to cooperate with them in any way, shape, or form beyond the basic protection of constitutional rights. Furthermore, anyone pushing land back in any form for any reason is functionally an imperialist, especially if they claim the exact opposite. Look again at the Plan to San Diego, a predecessor of land back that got Mexican Americans killed to advance some nebulous bourgeois agenda. It's still happening. The only people who can end American imperialism are the American workers. American workers hate and fear land back. Ergo, pushing land back helps the imperialists win. Given all that, anyone who calls themselves anti-imperialist and understands this dynamic, yet still pushes land back, values their precious little treason chance more than the fall of American imperialism, and therefore can't really be credited as an anti-imperialist at all. Complaining about why people can't get this when normies and workers refuse to cooperate with land back crews to make a Maoist-style united front happen is essentially just middle-class academia complaining about the working dumbs not reading enough books as they do yet again. This is a common refrain of theirs throughout the ages because they can't get it through their heads what a class privilege their education is, because that would mean admitting to themselves that they have class privilege. People can't get this because the workers don't have the spare time to study enough Maoist theory to understand why they should say, "Thank you, sir, may I have another," to every whiny middle-class minority under federal indictment. They just know they love their country and are going to defend it from the people who threaten them, whether they're the vampire squids up top or they're bespectacled enforcers in the professional managerial class in academia. If you middle-class academics want a Maoist-style united front to happen, you are going to have to reduce your demands and your lines to what the workers can agree to now, today, not 15 years after the revolution when you've hypothetically re-educated the problematicity out of them or whatever. Hiding the Landback lines is a good start, but revocably repudiating them is ultimately a prerequisite to victory on this continent. Waiting for the entire working class to spontaneously wake up one day and read and agree with Maoist theory so that they aren't repulsed by our best friend's toxic lines on the national question is ultra-radical and guaranteed to lead to defeat, because it rests on the premise that one day, spontaneously, absent all other changes, the working class will stop having the characteristics of the working class. That will clearly never happen. So the workers must be engaged with as the patriots they are if you want to end American imperialism. So if you want anti-imperialism to win here, you must not just appear to be patriots who will protect the workers in their country from their enemies. You must actually be such. Anything less will fail to recruit the most important class, the working class, to this Maoist-style anti-monopoly united front of yours. Trying to be cute about it by not mentioning your treasonous takes on the national question, but still keeping them in the bylaws or whatever, will be discovered by the workers and cited as evidence of your duplicity. There's no substitute to taking a hard line against all secession if you want an alliance with the American working class that will endure for the long run. I've warned people about this, and they ignore me and went about their Landback ways, but when I check in on their channels, they're still complaining about the friction they get from the workers about their treasonous lines on the national question, long after the radical Republicans stopped interacting with them in any way. So they aren't complaining about us anymore, about other groups that have chosen to stick more closely to the workers because they aren't blinded by their middle-class academic interests, and then can therefore clearly see the threat Landback poses to their proletarian outreach. They disregarded me as a crank, and they discovered that their mission field was full of nothing but cranks. I wasn't some annoying culture warrior insisting on being right because I mistook this for an academic argument. I was and am an anti-imperialist who wants and hopes to win, and who gets disgusted by these hopes being dashed on stolen land. And I was trying to warn them against hurting the anti-imperialist cause with this crap. In their academic arrogance, they thought they knew better, but they then discovered that reality is exactly as I described it to be, and they indeed have to change their ways or quit. They're still too arrogant to admit that out loud, because academics hate nothing more than learning from the workers, but their praxis increasingly resembles what I was telling them to do. I don't care about being right. I don't need an apology for the personal insults, for the arrogance endemic their class, for their disregarding my friendly but dire warnings behind closed doors until they became vociferous attacks against class enemies in public they were forced by reality to bend to. I will work with any functional anti-imperialist who doesn't attack the American workers or threaten their country, even if they've been personally abominable to me in the past and are too ashamed to admit it. I want to win. I hope to win. I expect to win, and the radical Republican's presidential candidate is currently on the verge of triumph, from whence he will pink-slip the American imperialist deep state, which is why I take all impediments to anti-imperialist victory so deadly seriously. But let's talk about what's inevitably going to happen to the proponents of secession themselves. According to the landmark free speech case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, any idea may be expressed under the First Amendment, even in dangerous or treasonous ones. But there is an exception to this, martial law, under which the Constitution consents to its own temporary suspension. What happens to land backroos when the Constitution is suspended historically? Well, it's only happened once during the last Civil War, when there was another group of race nationalist secessionists trying to tear this country apart, who called themselves the Confederacy. After secessionist movements flared up in the border states of Missouri and Maryland, Lincoln ordered them placed under martial law. Pro-Confederate newspapers were shut down and Confederate sympathizers rounded up. You know the national anthem? The rocket's red glare was making it possible for Francis Scott Key, the anthem's writer who was locked up in a British prison ship in Baltimore Harbor at the time, to see the American flag still flying defiantly over Fort McHenry even after days of British bombardment. Lincoln took this hallowed ground of America's national story, and he turned it into a gulag for race nats. Anyone chanting Landback today is going to have a whole lot of explaining to do when the next Civil War comes. Again, this is just me analyzing class and history and warning people who will probably disregard the warning because the class Lenin called society's shit always thinks it knows better than the working dumbs. When the deep state launches a second civil war, the Landbackeroos are going to be deeply suspect at best. The best prospects for Landbackeroos behind MAGA lines in the days to come are going to be as minor functionaries or maybe lower-level military officers. But even then, anytime they find themselves dealing with workplace politics, or if any of them try to run for office, their Landback connections will be their Achilles heel. Their political enemies, who might not even always necessarily be people I'd support, will merely be able to threaten to remind people about their previous treason enjoyment in order to get their own way. The only possible defense the Landbackeroos will have in that day, that historical class analysis tells me is surely coming, is to utterly renounce and denounce their previous ideas and to hug the American flag far closer than even I ever have. And to do it, the sooner they do it, the better. And that's the absolute best case for them. It's far likelier that the consequences of having been a Landbackeroo will be insta-gulag. The condition of the Lincolnian gulags were pretty bad, comparable to the prisoner of war camps on both sides of the time, and not everyone survived them. The Constitution can only be overridden by martial law, and Lincoln's gulags wrapped their work up for the most part by the end of the shooting, with only a few lingering on in places where the Ku Klux Klan were threatening a general insurgency. The 4 years of Gulag were not kind of the coddled middle-class academics who thought white nat treason that defended the worst capitalists on earth was a great idea. Many didn't make it out, and of those who did, their health was ruined enough that they couldn't live long enough to enjoy the eventual preeminence of the racist lost cause and its champions in the Dunning School, probably better termed the Dunning-Kruger School. This could be you one day if you let means made in Langley do your thinking for you. Not only could your involvement in these ideas destroy you personally, but they'll set back whatever else you're trying to achieve. Want a socialist America? Well, no one cares what the traitors think, so you'd better not be thought of as a traitor in those material conditions to come if you want to have any influence over politics. The best defense will be to have publicly recanted on your own before it became necessary. The earlier the better, which is why I hope those who have been pushing land back recently will do so. America won't be doing anything, by the way, that China isn't currently doing. China rightly keeps its Uyghur race nat Landbackeroos under control by rounding them up and putting them in labor camps until they learn patriotism. Well, those unpatriotic would-be Adrian Zenzes against America will deserve a taste of the same efficacious medicine, and we can thank their Maoist Third Worldist comrades in China for the good idea. There will be a mirror image of this during the next Civil War, as there was in the last one, though. In the last one, the Appalachians were bastions of pro-Union and anti-slavery sentiment in the South, and the Confederate police state rounded up and shot all of those people that they could find. Tennessee, in particularly, was an orgy of blood and fascism so terrible it has no equal in American history. Even so, they couldn't stop the counter-secession of loyal West Virginia. They couldn't stop the underground pro-Union sentiment that had powered the Underground Railroad. They couldn't stop these people coming out of the woodworks to cheer their vengeance passing through in the form of William Tecumseh Sherman.
Again, Uncle Billy.
I've got more to say about Sherman in an upcoming video, by the way, and I'm going to also be talking about what Karl Marx thought about the March to the Sea, but that's for, like I said, a future video. The mirror image of the coming MAGA neo-Lincolnian gulags will be the woke death camps. The wokes and race nats will be possessed with a temper tantrum so terrible it will make Confederate Tennessee look like child's play. And just like Confederate Tennessee, the victims of their race nat police state will be the humble but patriotic workers behind their lines. And just like the Antichrist, great will be their wrath, for they will know their time is short. And just like the Antichrist, the woke death camps will be unleashed for about 4 to 7 years, which is generally how long capitalist crises last. And just like Confederate Tennessee, they will ultimately lose so hard that 7 generations later, the descendants of their victims will still wave Old Glory around, a perfectly wordless way of saying, fuck your heritage. Seriously, drive through Tennessee sometime. You'll never see Americans' flags so big, and that's why. The heritage of most of Tennessee is bleeding for this nation behind enemy lines for years with no hope of rescue. The red parts of California and New York will undergo similar trials, and they too will ultimately know the joy of Unionist armies liberating them from their fascist nightmare. And now you know, and knowing is half the battle.
Latte Express.
Next time on Hot Take Express. Do it again, Uncle Billy. This time to Silicon Valley.